Hello, I'm Colin Gawtry and I'd like to welcome you to the first part of this programme entitled The Bigger Picture. What I want to do over the next sort of 45 to 50 minutes or so is to share with you some of the key principles that underpin the programme that we're doing here and the work that we're going to be doing over the next 6 parts, because it's really important, A, to contextualise the work, but also to give you sight of what's to follow and what's to come. And you may well have read some of this on the website, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a feel for the whole so that we can actually see where we're starting out. Today I'm going to concentrate on looking at the bigger picture, and I'm going to start to give you some of these really important analytical tools so that you can start to make sense of your environment. In the next part we're going to be looking at the politics. So once we've understood the big picture, what's going on within that? What is it that is happening with the key people and their agendas? And this whole thing about office politics we're going to start to cover in the next part, because it's really important that you understand it, not so that you can play it, but so that you can at least understand critical ways that you can adapt the way you are responding to those sort of behaviours if you encounter them, but also start to understand some of the bigger power moves that are going on that are going to be affecting your work as a strategic influencer and making things happen. What usually happens in those two parts is we start to expose an awful lot of gaps in your knowledge and your understanding and your insight. So the third part of the program is really looking at how you can build much stronger relationships, more intimate relationships with key people within your network and with your stakeholders, so that you can gain the trust, so they tell you what's really going on, so that they help you to fill those gaps. And that is a critical resource to build so that you can interact and come up with much more effective strategies to dramatically move things forward. In part 4 we're going to be then looking at, having gained a really clear understanding of what's going on in the whole and the politics and started to build those relationships. So what are the fundamental power dynamics that are going on that are shaping the way the group or the arena that you're looking at is making decisions? And that's really important, because if you don't understand that, when you come up with your vision and your goal, you're going to hit the buffers or you're going to hit some big surprises. So it's important that it's not about sort of just going with the favouring wind. It's about actually understanding the shape that those winds are taking so that you can craft your own presence within that a lot more effectively. Following that, you're then in a position that, you've got a really good understanding of the place where you want to be much more influential, and you can start to develop a lot more of your vision and your goals and what it is you're going to make happen, so that it's set in reality, it's contextualized within what's really going on, but it can still be stretching and progressively so. So part 5 will be about that, and again there's a lot of frameworks and models that I'm going to share with you in that part, which will really help you to speed forward very, very quickly, so that we get to part 6, which is sort of looking basically at how you're going to take that skill set, that new capability, and really ramp it up an awful lot more to make a much bigger impact and build a really strong reputation, either for you as an individual or for your team. So that's the pathway that we're going to be going through. And today what I'd like to begin with is looking at the bigger picture. And this is really about looking at the group or the arena or the area where you want to become much, much more influential. And I'm appreciative that there is a lot of different people joining in on this program in a lot of different positions within hierarchies and even within the organizational setting, or some even not within a big organization. But it's important to actually say, okay, so what's the shape of your environment? What is it that you are trying to influence and become much more influential with? And I'm going to be, as I said, sharing some of the mapping tools. Before I get to that today, I do want to stop on attitude, because fundamentally there are some key things you need to be appreciating about the attitude that you convey, the sort of values that you are putting into your behaviours when you go out to interact with that environment, that can either make you or break you when it comes to influence. And I've seen a lot over the last sort of 10 to 12 years, having been specialising in this area. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that will really, really help you. And then we can get into, so overall, where is it you're trying to go? What is the area of your responsibility in your work? And some key things that I've noticed, particularly relevant to leadership, that again can help you speed forward and maybe start to explain some of the reasons why you've not got as far as perhaps you'd hoped at this point in time. Because once you appreciate that, you can then start to step around some of those roadblocks. And then the main part of today will be about, okay, so if that's where you want to be influential, how can you get your hands on it? How can you really understand it in a lot more depth? Which will then lead into some very practical actions that I want you to take, some analyses that I want you to take, and that will be backed up by the materials on the website and exercises and further readings. So without further ado, I want to start talking about the attitudes just for a couple of moments. We'll have question time in around about sort of 15 to 20 minutes. So please do put them into the facility on the technology so that Rain can start to collect those for you. But some of the attitudes, and you know, attitude is everything when it comes to a lot of things in life, but particularly with influence. And I'm going to talk more about the positive than the negative attitudes. So the attitudes that can seriously help you rather than the negative ones, because they've become abundantly obvious. But we might get into some of that when we come to the questions. So the first set of attitudes that I want to talk about, and probably this is the most important one when it comes to learning how to become a more strategic and successful influencer, is curiosity. So many times I come across people who are not interested in what other people are trying to do. They've got their own life, their own world, their own work that they're trying to get done, and who can blame them? But what gets in the way is lack of curiosity and that lack of interest, because there is so much to learn. As you'll find out later on as we get through this particular part, the number of gaps that you will start to discover in your knowledge is going to be enormous. And if you can develop and cultivate a curious attitude, a curious approach to your surroundings, be it the big picture, your team or your group, you will fare an awful lot better. The second one then may seem a little bit of an odd one to put there, but altruism, I think, is a really important value and attitude to adopt, because what that means is that's looking for the good of the whole. And that may seem a little bit strange or alien to many of you at the moment, but I think there's a very serious part to this, and the part that actually comes from a more ethical stance. And I've seen time and time again people who are really serving their own agenda, looking for, you know, what they can get out of a particular situation, or probably out of most situations. In the long term, they don't fare so well. And I think it's really important that, and this is part of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, is actually showing people that you don't have to be like everybody else pursuing their own selfish agenda. You can actually get an awful long way with a lot of integrity, with a lot of ethics, and a very good, well-meaning approach, and still get your own agenda met as well. But I think it's really important that you approach, okay, any sort of scenario that you're looking at with a view that I want to make things better for all of us. And that is setting you up then to gain more information. Your curiosity will sort of come to help you even more, and starting to build some of the relationships which we'll get onto more in some of the later parts. The other attitude that is really, really important, and I think it's partly because it's certainly in large, complex organisations, influence is quite difficult. There's quite a lot of barriers to it, quite a lot of obstacles to overcome. And I think it's really important, and I think you will notice this as you sort of get through this programme, to be really ambitious and to look way beyond where you are at the moment. And in a moment I'll tell you how you can do that. But I think it's really important to stretch yourself, to see how far you can go to actually get things done. And the more you embrace the tools and the ideas and the technologies that we've got here, the approaches that we've got here, the more you'll start to realise you're capable of. As you start to exercise it, you start to see some results, and you start to think, okay, well, how can I do some more? So I think it's really important that you can cultivate that and continue to use, quite an ambitious sort of approach, because there is a lot to overcome. There are a lot of obstacles. It's not an easy ride. And if you've got that ambition fueling your activity, then you're going to fare an awful lot better. Another set of values and attitudes that I think are really important is optimism. you've got to believe, I think, or it really helps you if you believe that you will win through in the end. You know, it may be difficult, but you are going to get there. And being very ambitious and tying that in with the belief that, yeah, I'm going to be able to make this happen. I'm going to be able to find a way. You may not know how you're going to do it. You may hit some obstacles and not really realise, you know, what you're going to do to correct it. But please try to cultivate that you will win through in the end. And if that's backed up by and fueled by an altruistic motive where you're looking for the good of all, then I think that's very reasonable to believe that somehow you are going to get through that, despite some of the duplicitous characters that there might be around your organisation. And then later on we'll sort of talk about how you might be able to counter some of those. But I think it's about being very optimistic, and I think that's really, really important. Certainly the best influencers that I've met over the years have all been very optimistic, very confident that they're going to be able to win through. You may not feel like that at the moment, but we're on the beginning of a journey, not midway through. And so as you start to practice, you'll start to realise, okay, yeah, there is some hope here. Okay, and the next thing is the tenacity. To keep coming back, the resilience to actually have a knock. Okay, we all get them where you don't get what you want out of a particular situation, and you've got to keep coming back if you are to win through. And again, you can see, perhaps start to see these are all sort of tying together. And I've sort of ended this little series off of the key values and attitudes to cultivate with the old ethical, which is, I don't believe that you need to delude people, to deceive people in the act of influence. And if you start to read some of the articles that I've written over the last few years in particular, you'll start to see that there is a common theme coming through here. Other experts in this area sort of turn a blind eye to that and sort of teach how to do all of this stuff and don't address the ethical question. I believe it is right to actually aim to influence people to really want to do what you want them to do in the light of full information. So looking at it in a very clear, concise, honest, authentic way, I think will get you an awful lot further. But it's also a fascinating subject in its own right, because, you know, and within this program, I'm sure there are people from all over the world in all sorts of different cultures. So what is ethical to one culture might be completely viewed differently in another culture. And there are some very interesting philosophical debates that you could have about that. But I think it's really important that each and every one of us forms our own view of what is right and the right way to proceed, so that we don't realise that we've done something in a couple of weeks' time or a couple of months' time or even years, that we've done something really wrong that we don't feel, you know, good about. So, you know, I'm always sort of saying, look, try to use the ethical way, try to get people to want to do what you want them to do. And if you combine all of these six attitudes, I think you will fare an awful lot better. But they don't change overnight, and if you haven't got all of these, a lot of it will come as you start to see that the things that we've got within this program do actually work. And there's just one more that I want to stress, because it's really important, because there's a lot of angst around these sort of areas about how to become more influential, particularly when you're up against opposition. Try to have some fun with it, and particularly tying that in with the curiosity. I'm saying curiosity in a positive, fun way. Look, there's a bit of a puzzle here, and the fact that you don't understand your environment well enough at the moment, you know, shouldn't be seen as being a negative. That's a challenge. How are you going to find out? And try to decode the puzzle, try to build the jigsaw that will help you to see a very, very clear picture. And if you're doing it in a fun way, one of the key things that you're going to gain is you're more likely to go and do it. You're more likely to ask those questions that you really need to ask. And so it's really important to try to basically just chill out and enjoy some of this. It is simple once you get into it, and by cultivating these attitudes, you are going to fare an awful lot better, I promise you. So that's all I wanted to say on attitudes, but if you've got any questions about those, please do put them in the question box, and I'll come to those in about 5 or 10 minutes. Because before I do, I want to sort of step into the realms of why are you doing this, and around your role, where is it you're trying to go? Because it is important that you start to fix your sights on something specific that you want to achieve. Now, everybody's in slightly different positions, and you know, I've done a lot of work on this, and it actually came into one of the last books that I published on influential leadership, quite important. of why these things aren't getting done as much as they should get done, particularly about leadership. And here is a little model that I want to talk you through that sort of contextualizes where I'm coming from, but also helps to explain some of the things you really need to do in order to dramatically increase your level of influence. And it starts with the idea of making progress, because whether you're a leader or whether you're a technical specialist, whatever it is, if you're in gainful employment, you're being expected to make progress, you're expected to get things done. However, what I noticed in many, many organisations these days is that the amount of progress that needs to be made is far more than is capable of anybody that is being given to do it. And it's almost like as soon as you get something done, something more comes on your plate. There's, okay, well, if they've done that, now they can do that. We've got another emergency, etc., etc., etc. Or somebody leaves and therefore reducing your resources. So, there's ever a need to make progress. But the problem is that most of that progress is about short-term imperatives, the short-term need. How are we going to deliver this particular project? It's behind at the moment. The stakeholders are clamoring, or the clients are clamoring for it to be done. We've got to, these emergencies and crises, we've got to do that. But longer term, there is a need, a desperate need to develop more vision and more leadership, and as I put on this model, more purpose. So what is it that if you could achieve would solve a lot of these short-term problems? And progressively, if you get time to focus on the bigger picture and the bigger long-term game plan that you're trying to unfold, you will start to get more excited about it. But the problem for most leadership and in my particular view, having seen a lot of leadership development, they haven't got time to develop that longer term vision because they're not making enough progress in the day job. So what I'm advocating here is, and everything that we've got within this program will help you to do this, is to first work out how to bring the day job under control. It is really, really important that you focus on creating some space, because if you've got crises in your working life, they have to be fixed without regard to that longer term sort of progress and that longer term purpose or vision. So you've got to arrest that out of controlness and try to find ways of actually bringing that under control, so that you create space not to deal with more crises or more important things that have got to be done yesterday, but so that you can actually start to think about the bigger picture and the longer term progress that you're looking to make. And I think they're really, really important, because the more time that you can then invest into that sort of pursuit and that sort of activity, that visioning of what the future might be like, the more excited you'll get about it, the more passionate you will get about it. And it is really important because, and it needs to be relevant to you in your position and where you are at the moment, but passion is what drives further progress. And we were talking earlier on about the attitudes. Well, this is where your tenacity comes, your optimism. You've got to be passionately connected to the vision that you're trying to influence within your environment. Otherwise, you're not going to have the staying power. You're not going to have the tenacity to keep going until you get there. But unless you spend time and invest time focusing on, what it is you want to achieve in your vision, you're not going to develop the passion. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It has to be bred from real activity and real almost dreaming and visioning of what the future is going to be like. And you can't do that unless you make some progress. So that's a long way of saying that what I want you to do and think about as you go through this program is thinking, okay, so what do I need to influence right now to start to bring things under control? And what do I need to start influencing for the longer term? And it is a very personal thing. And sat here on one end of the camera, I can't sort of predict what it's going to be like for you. So you need to embed this in your own role and your own context. But increasingly, as you get used to using these ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you, increasing your level of influence and becoming more influential and getting more results, your ambition will then start to escalate. Well, if I can do that, well, how about doing this? So to start off with, your vision might be, and where you need to make progress is, I'll take over the next 3 months, I need to bring this project under control. But then maybe over the next year, if I could influence some more resources, if I could get another team on it recruited, then you'll be an awful lot better. Then when you start to make progress on that, you think, well, if I can get that team, how about we start a new division? How about if we maybe even start a new company or a new sort of business line? And so it starts to grow. But it only grows if you're continuing to make progress. And I think that's really, really important, because this whole thing, and in its best, and I'll come to questions in just a moment, but in its best, your purpose needs to turn almost to the level of being an obsession. And the reason why I say that is that you need to be thinking about it day in, day out. Not just thinking about it once a month or once a quarter when you get around to reviewing your personal development or something like that. This needs to almost become you to maximize your potential of where you're going, where you're taking your role, your professional life, your working life, or indeed your life as a whole. But it is contextual on you and where you are right now, but progressively this will get more. And the reason why I believe it needs to become almost as an obsession is so that you maintain that focus, so you get that tenacity, so everything that comes into your inbox, you can be thinking, how does that contribute to the progress that I'm needing to make here? How does that contribute to growing my vision or moving towards my vision? And you can start to weed out the many, many distractions that will come into that inbox or onto your phones or your social media or whatever, because that's going to distract you from your purpose. So building that purpose strong enough that you become passionate and almost obsessional about it will help you to move forward in dramatic ways. And that's really what we're trying to get to. You know, this is about really stretching and really moving forward an awful lot faster. So I want to bring in Rain now to ask if there's any questions you'd like me to deal with.
Okay, we have some great questions here. Peter is asking, is it possible to get to the top without, quote, politics, unquote? The word has negative connotations, so how do we counter this and make politics an accepted part of the business agenda?
Brilliant question, Peter. Thank you for that. I'm going to be very clear about this. There is no way of getting to the top without engaging in politics. But what we will discover in the next part, and we'll be going into that in a lot more detail in the next part, you need to understand the politics. You don't necessarily need to play them. You need to be engaging in them, but you don't need to do it in a negative way. Yes, of course, there will always come times when your own ethical stance and your own morals and values will be tested in that rise to the top. But I'm a firm believer in that you can actually get there. And it's not just me. I mean, I would cite some research that was done by Harvard Business Review quite a while ago now, about sort of 15 years ago, which I picked up, where they were looking at the difference between a great CEO candidate and an elite one. And they came up with 5 different areas of competencies, and one of them was politics. And what was different between the great and the elite was that the great candidate for a CEO position really understood the politics and could play the game. They knew how to work the politics to their advantage or the advantage of their purpose, whatever that was. The elite ones had a reputation for playing it straight. And this is not, sort of small research, this is major research. So you've got to be able to get your hands around the politics, and that's why we're spending a complete part of this program sort of looking at how you can learn those politics. So a great question, Peter, and it is very much, there's a lot of emotion attached to that, and again, we'll be covering that in the next part.
Okay, he's got another great question here. How do you combine a professional obsession, quote, obsession, with wider life balance of other roles, for example, father, husband, sibling, etc.?
That's a tough one. And really it comes down to an individual choice. And there is a very grave risk if in your professional life you become obsessional, that will push out the other things. And I think it's something that, each one of us need to negotiate with our nearest and dearest and other aspects of our life so that we get some appropriate balance. But it does come down to a personal choice. But I want to make a very clear point here. it should be a conscious choice. And you should be drawing some boundaries and limitations around this, otherwise it will get out of control. And I think, whenever you're stepping into these things, if you don't put some limits around it, you'll fall into it. You'll fall into spending, sort of 20 hours a day working on these things and, having fun in your professional life while your wife or partner disappears. And that's a travesty, because, it's really, really important and self-rejuvenating to have those support mechanisms around. So somehow you need to find some rules that you can ascribe to, that you can lay down. I am not going to work more than 10 hours a day on this, or something like that, to try to govern or bring in some balance, and then get your nearest and dearest to help you police that. Oh, that's 10.5 hours today, dear, or something like that. And maybe have a bit of fun with it as well, but it's almost like learning to be able to switch it on during the time that you've allotted it to it. But there is a very grave risk. But with every grave risk, if you do it consciously, you can mitigate that, you can reduce it, and you can actually protect yourself, rather than waiting till too late and you find out that everything else is broken in your life. That wouldn't be a very good thing, would it?
Okay, and we have a question here from Brian. How can you change your attitudes?
Ooh, how can you change your attitude? I think, there are some exercises that you can look at on the website, which are really important, but we fall into attitudes in the main without any conscious thought. Suddenly we realise we've got these attitudes, be it positive, negative, or any of the other ways of describing or attributing certain attitudes. But what's actually going on is it's a combination of the behaviours that you deploy and the results that you get and the subsequent decisions that you make that fine-tune the attitudinal and behavioural responses. So the trick, I think, or the technique for trying to start to change some of these is, number one, be very clear and aware of the sort of attitudes that you've got now. And there is an exercise that you can do on this that you'll see on the website below this part. Be very clear on where you are at the moment, but also be very clear about where you want to get to. I think would be point number two. Point number three would be really motivate yourself. Like, well, how is your life going to change if you are able to adopt those attitudes? And I think that's really important, that you sort of see some benefit in adopting a different approach. Then you can start thinking about, well, what behaviours would display that attitude? And almost build a little bit of a model about, well, what does somebody with tenacity look like, sound like, what are they doing? And start to just make it very simple and think, okay, the top 5 things that I need to be doing to display an attitude or to have an attitude of tenacity would be X, Y, Z. Well, okay, it was 5, but you know what I mean. And then once you've done that, start behaving like them and noticing the results that you get. And sometimes it means, sort of putting on a bit of a front, and maybe that's not, you might say that's not very authentic. But the point is, you've got to try these behaviours in a different way to see what results that you get. And that's the only way of then judging. And sometimes this judgment is done at a subconscious level. Well, actually, that worked, didn't it? Oh, well, I benefited from adopting that sort of behaviour. Well, I'll do it again then. And so things start to change and you move towards your vision of what you want to be like. So those are just some tips, but please do sort of make use of the exercises. And there are a lot, I've written a lot on attitudes over the years, so you can also search within the website to look at other articles and other stimulation on attitude, particularly on how you might change that. But awareness is a key to that. Okay. So what I want to do now is talk about arenas and groups and where you want to be influential. And what I notice happening with a lot of people as they start to think, okay, how can I be more influential? Is the bewildering complexity that there is around it. And what I think is really, really important is that you've somehow got to get to grips and put some shape to that complexity. And this is where I come down to identifying arenas or groups. And you're all in slightly different positions with regard to this. So I'm going to try to give you all something that you can grab hold of. But one of the easiest questions to ask, in which group do you wish to be more influential? That could be within your company. It could be within your industry. It could be, frankly, within your team. I want to be able to influence my team more effectively. But the reason why that is important is because different groups behave and respond in different ways. There are different dynamics going on. And one of the biggest barriers to successful influence is not being able to get your hands on how it's working, where you want to be successful, where you want to actually get that influence. So I think it's really important to actually identify, okay, so fundamentally, this is where I want to be more influential. I'm nowhere near as influential, say at a divisional level, or within my department, and I want to do something about that. Because then you can start to actually focus your analysis and say, okay, so how is it for that group? What is going on in that group? What are the pressures that they're under that I need to sort of understand more about before I start to go and engage? Because different groups operate in completely different ways. They have different values, and you can't be all things to all people. So the idea here is to, right up front, you say, okay, that's where I want to be more influential, and this is how I'm going to move it forward. And that starts to give some sort of real practical sort of utility to and application to a lot of what we've got to cover. And it starts to save a lot of time, because you need to learn the ropes. You need to learn how to interact with that particular group if you want to become more successful. And rather than trying to learn every group, you can start to prioritize, and that's really where this is coming from. But life isn't as simple as the image that I've got up there at the moment, because it's not only a neat hierarchical sort of group structure that you're needing to look at. So you are within your team, within a department, and so on. You're probably in many different teams. And particularly in large, complex organizations, you might have dual reporting lines, for instance, or you might be on a project. So there's another set of groups that you might need to be considering, and you've got to be very clear again on where it is you want to be most influential. But then within each of those groups, there may be subgroups. So there are more groups that and so it's no wonder that people get really confused about the sort of things they need to do to become more influential, because there are so many groups, particularly in large organizations or value chains, supply chains, and so on and so forth. But still, it doesn't end there. And I know there are a lot of people on this program who are running projects, and projects can cut across in a different dimension altogether, picking up different people from different parts of the organization and outside the organization as well, with suppliers and customers and so on. So there is a lot of complexity here, and you need to find a way of decoding this. And again, the resources that are available in this part will help to show you how to do that. But some of the things that I think are really worth holding on to before we get into the analysis are, so fundamentally, what are you trying to achieve here? And with that will evolve as you go through this program, I am sure. But right now, think, okay, so maybe looking at the day job and what you've got, what progress you've got to do to bring your role, your work, your life under control. That's your purpose. Okay, so what are the main groups? And the really strong, clearly identifiable groups that have a bearing on what it is you're trying to do. And that might be the first port of call, because part of what you're going to be learning during this program is the analytical skills. So we've got to get some really serious analysis done so that you can see how it works, and then you can replicate it on lots and lots of different groups. But looking for the groups that can have the biggest impact on your purpose right now will help you to simplify some of these. But you've got to be able to draw a line around them. So they've got to have a clear identity. They've got to be a cohesive group as well. Otherwise, they're not a group. I mean, it may sound a little bit obvious, but particularly as you step outside into maybe the industry or your profession or something like that, if that's really important to you and where you need to focus to be able to start to make progress towards your purpose, quite often they're not organised as a group. They don't identify themselves as a group, apart from maybe in professional disciplines like IMechE or the Chartered Accountants or something like that. But there's got to be some sort of sense of cohesion. There's got to be some sort of definition of a group that the group recognises well. And if they're to affect your purpose, they've got to be powerful. So what are the groups that are most powerful that have a bearing on what it is you're trying to do? And that's where you start to consider, okay, so how active are they? Because if they're powerful, usually they're exerting their power. but particularly when it comes to informal groups that might be collections of people that have something unique in common, like maybe they've all got an MBA or they've all come from a previous company or something like that. What you need to notice is the most active ones are the ones that are going to cause you the most trouble or present the best opportunity for correcting things and making things happen in the way that you need to make them. But again, it comes back to, if the group is not having any impact in your realm or towards your purpose, why bother? So you don't have to analyze a group just because it's there. Try to find groups that are going to have a material impact one way or the other on what it is you're trying to do. So now I want to know, I'm assuming, and part of the homework and the follow-up work will be, okay, so what are these groups? And I've got some exercises you can do to start to identify all of these. So what I want to do now is sort of show you a way of starting to analyze them. And this is based on the research that I've done over the years and the practice of actually helping a lot of executives and directors to sort of really get to understand the politics and the dynamics that they have to engage with. And I think I've already started to sort of allude to some of this, that you've got to be focusing on a discrete group. So make sure that to start off with, you've got a group that you can analyze. And quite often, and in many of your cases I am sure, it's very easy to say that because, well, it's marketing or it's HR or it's a particular project team, because there is a formal structure around you. But one of the exercises I want you to look at as well is also looking for informal groups, like, as I mentioned earlier on, the MBA club, or there may be sports clubs or professional interest groups that could have a material impact on what it is you're doing. So they don't have to be formal ones, but they do have to recognize each other. So everybody in marketing generally recognizes, hey, I'm part of marketing. And so that's point number 2 there, is about members are identifying it. But they've also got to have a way of communicating. And, with informal groups, that's fairly straightforward. But an informal group doesn't become a group if they can recognize they've got something in common, so they've all got an MBA, but until they start to convene meetings and they start to have like an email list that they or a social media group, a Facebook group or something like that, they're not going to start operating as a group. So don't worry about them if they're not able to communicate, unless you can provide that means of communication and you can harness the collective power and bring them all together. But maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit there. The other thing about a group to be worth analysing is there's got to be some sort of objective. They've got to have an agenda that they're pushing forward and trying to advance. And I think that's really something that you need to be watching. And this is really where it starts to dip into looking at the detail of the analysis that you need to do, which I'll come to in a moment. But I do need to stress, and you're probably looking at these thinking, God, this is going to be an awful lot of work. Yes, it is. There is a lot of work to be done here, and there is a lot of fact-finding that you need to do, which is where, if you like, it comes back to really making it a priority to get the day job under control so that you can start to find some time to invest in this pursuit. But a little bit like Peter's question earlier on about the politics and being able to get to the top without the politics, unless you invest the time, unless you find the time and put the effort into learning how these groups are operating, you are not going to succeed to any marked extent. It really does take that. But the good news is that if you tap into your curious attitude and you have a bit of fun with it, it won't be hard work. It will be a curious adventure that you'll go on, you'll start learning. And over the weeks and the months, your intelligence, your knowledge will start to grow at an exponential rate because you'll be adding to previous learning. And I think that's where it starts to. So to begin with, yes, it is hard work. And here's why it's hard work, because some of the things that I'm going to be asking you in the exercises to consider with a priority group or your arena where you need to analyze is, well, what's its history? And I'm recommending here that you start to jot some notes down. Don't just do it in your mind. Don't just, that's an easy thing to do on a train or a plane or something, or worse than that, even if you're driving while you're thinking about a million other things together. But no, invest some serious time in writing down or typing down the answers to these questions for the group that you're analysing. But the history of it, where has it come from? What brought it into being? And that's formal or informal. You just need to understand where it's been and the journey it's had so far, because that can have quite a big impact. For instance, what was it, a compliance committee? So there's a group that is called compliance or governance that was brought about because of a lawsuit, or maybe a government intervention that said, hang on, you guys can't do this, you've got to put some more check. What was it that started that group? Because that will start to give you some clues on the power that it has. That power may be waning because of other events that have happened in history, but you also need to look at, well, how have they been pursuing that history, or what have they been doing over the last X number of years since they've been founded? And it may be that they started off with a huge mandate because of government legislation changes, but because they have not been effective, they have lost power over the years because they've tried to do things and the business has squashed them out. So they're losing a lot of power. By tapping in and understanding that track record and what it is they're doing, can give you some really good clues on how best to handle them and how best to influence them. I've got development stage there because, particularly really with new groups coming together, there are a lot of different models about development stages that you can look at. And, probably the most famous one is the forming, storming, norming and performing one, where when a group come together, they all look at each other wondering what to do. And then they start jockeying for position and saying, no, I'm going to be the leader of this group, or I'm going to be prominent within this group. I'm going to take as much of this responsibility as I can. And so there's a lot of storming going on and a lot of internal battles that are raging before they all start to settle down, accept their place within the group structure. And that's when they start to really, really perform. But each different stage of the development of a group will require you to actually potentially take a different strategy if you want to influence them. So influencing a high-performing team, a coherent team that all understand their roles, is a very, very different task to one that's just forming at the beginning stage. And you can take some different measures to actually establish your position within that group or your influence within that group. I'm conscious that many of these might be fairly self-explanatory, so I'm going to go through these quite quickly now because there are more readings that you can do with these on the website. But particularly once you've understood its origins and where it's going on, or where it is right now and where it needs to go, this is where the purpose comes in. Because as you have ambition, as you have objectives, so does any group. Even informal groups will have an objective usually around, okay, so what do we want to do for ourselves? How do we want to forward our profession or become more influential as accountants or HR people or something like that? So any group worth noticing is driving an agenda forward, and you really, really need to understand that, because it's only by linking with their agenda and adding value to their agenda in their perception that you really start to accelerate your interest. And this is probably one of the most powerful things, at least in this part, that you need to recognize, is that by actually just ploughing your own agenda, by saying this is what I want you to do, doesn't cut with many people unless you're really, really powerful. The only way, or the best way, of being able to move forward and influence people is to entwine what you want with what they want, which is why you've got to understand the group and where they're heading and what they're trying to achieve. Because if you have got the answer to their problems, the things that they're trying to achieve, then you're going to be very popular, and they're going to say, well, how can we help you? Or that's certainly the direction that you're taking. They'll certainly be more amenable to doing favours for you and helping you in the pursuit of your objectives as well, because they've got problems and they want to solve these. Moving on down, structure and organisation is sort of fairly straightforward, particularly for formal groups. But another way of looking at it is, how do they make decisions? So do things escalate up to a senior management group or committee? How do they actually behave when they get there? How do they actually meet a decision? Is it by majority, or is it just one or two key powerful people that will carry the day? How do they communicate with each other? All of these things are necessary, because then you start to reveal the different avenues and the different approaches you might be able to use when you want to influence them. Culture and values is really important. Culture is almost like a means to smooth through relations in any particular group, and it's commonly sort of touted as being the collective group norms or beliefs or values. What is it that they believe to be important? And with any group, particularly a group with that is cohesive and has got a clear identity, they will have very clear ways of doing things, what is important to them, which may be very different from you and maybe the group that you're coming from. It will certainly be different to the other groups that they have to interact with. But the important thing is you know that what they feel is being important. Because if you contradict or threaten any of the things that they hold dear, any of the things that they believe to be important, then you're going to struggle. You're going to find it an awful lot more difficult. This isn't to say you've got to agree with them to become influential, but it is something that you need to appreciate and understand and work with in some way. And if you are going to start to attack or to threaten something that they hold dear, you need to think very carefully about how you're going to do that, and you're going to have to get very strategic in the pursuit of that. Membership is really about how stable is the membership of that group. So, for instance, marketing can be destabilized by a takeover when you suddenly got another 100% of people joining. So suddenly the group doubles in size. So it's important to actually recognize what's going on there, because that can completely destabilize their culture, even their agenda and their purpose. So you need to have a bit of a fix on that, but also key people coming and going. So if powerful people are leaving the group, it could make them more amenable to a particular type of influence or a particular track that you might want to take. So these are really the main considerations, or the initial considerations, because it can go a lot deeper. And again, I would encourage you, you've got to be careful where you apply yourself, because you've only got so much time, of course, but I'm giving you more questions than you will probably be able to hope to answer for probably any single group that you're going to analyze. And that's a problem if there are a lot of big gaps, but you've got to make the judgment about what gaps you're prepared to live with. Because going down this list, you can see, and this is probably looking and getting to the nub of the problem that the group is trying to solve. And you need to understand that, because that then starts to really clarify the agenda and the challenge that they are facing. So looking at what is threatening them, what is influencing that group from outside. Could it be legislation? Could it be another department within the organisation that is trying to do the same job and there is overlap, so they're feeling threatened there? Could it be that their performance is down and they're not performing for the rest of the organisation? A lot of other executives are sort of on their back saying, no, we need this, you need you to shape up and start to deliver. All of those sort of things need to be known. How things are changing and the trends within the group are also useful to know, because if you can see where they've come from and how they've got there and what is changing within the group, you can start to predict, in the light of the problems, how they might make decisions in the future. What track, what strategy might they develop and evolve in order to start solving some of the problems that they need to solve, or to make the progress that they need to make. So these are really, really good things to start to spot. Internal opinion is an important thing. So the more you can understand about how solid and coherent is that internal opinion, or is it divided? I mean, the whole thing about divide and conquer, this is where it comes in, because you need to know the shape and the solidity of the decisions that they're making. Because if there is a gap there, if it's not quite safe and some powerful people are against it, others have carried the day at this juncture, you may be actually able to form a stronger relationship with those people who've been sort of put on the sideline, so that they can come back into power and carry the day for them. And again, it's about forming some of these political alliances. Might be an option. It's certainly the way these things are going. Another question to ask is, what are they celebrating at the moment? So what's going really well? And I think this is really important, because, there are things that they're proud of. There are things that they're really pleased of. And if you knock those, if you try to belittle those, it's almost like saying to somebody that you don't like what they're doing, you don't like their behaviour. And if somebody said that to you, rightly or wrongly, you'd still feel a bit upset and you'd still feel a little bit slighted. And there's a lot in group dynamics about how you can influence a group. And one of the most important things is, to influence a group, you've got to be accepted and recognised by that group rather than being somebody that's attacking that group. So it's almost like you've got to become an honorary member of the group so that you can then start to work on the inside, get to know even more about that group so that you can then start to exert some influence. But, you know, the sort of adage that I quite often put out is you first got to fit in to a group before you can stand out and really influence them. So, you know, bear those sort of things in mind. But this does go into an awful lot of detail. And as you start to get to the analysis, and we'll come to some questions in a moment, I'm conscious that time is going on, but as you're starting to do this, as you're starting to record it, making sure you're focusing on the most important groups around you, you'll start to fill a few more of these gaps. And it is through the investment of time in this activity, in this pursuit, that the bigger picture starts to become clear. The more objective you can be as you are pursuing these facts, the better you will fare, because you do need that almost like independent look at what's going on, because then it puts you in a much stronger position to see how you fit in. If you go in filtering your knowledge and your bias about, well, they're doing that wrong, no. What fundamentally, independently, are they doing wrong that they need to start fixing, as if you're almost like an external auditor looking at it, because we're very, very easily seduced by our own opinions, right? And it's important to try to get as close to the facts as you possibly can. Then you can start to think, okay, and this is where I am, this is what I'm trying to do, now how can I start to influence that? But you've got to get this understanding before you can really start to become accurate about the moves that you want to make. So at this point, I'm going to ask if Rain's got any questions for me.
We do. We have a bunch of great questions here. Greg is asking, how do you behave ethically when you are pitching a strategy laid down by your boss to another group of people when you don't agree with the strategy and neither do the group?
That's a big problem, Greg. That's a real big problem, because, you know, there is something fundamentally wrong, and if you don't agree with it, you've got to make some personal decisions. And the point that I'm always making, and you'll see this coming through in the readings, is, you know, ethical rules, there's very little prospect of actually getting a clear right or wrong. And in a way, it's about your measure of comfort at an individual level with what you're being asked to do. And that comes down to your own personal sense of integrity. So what I usually suggest at these points in time is, number one, be very, very clear what it is your sense of integrity actually is. What is it? What are your values? And what are your limitations? Because if you think these things through beforehand, and I often say this, at what point will you resign over a particular point, then it's not to say you always live by that necessarily, but you've got that then as a base on which to react to anything that is going on. But I've seen time and time again with certain executives and things like that getting into positions where they tell their people to go and tell a story and to lie about the reality of the situation or the problems that they're having. They don't want the senior executive or the PMO or anything to know. And so you've got to recognize that you're in that position. But then I always say, you know, track back, because fundamentally there's something going wrong here that isn't going to help you in the long term necessarily, but you're being pushed to do something. And you've got to actually start to think about how you influence back the other way. You know, and looking at really your influence and challenge is not so much about influencing the other group, and a terrible situation to be in, I know, but it's about influencing your boss and your team that there is a better way of achieving your objective. And that's a hard thing, particularly if they're a political player, but we'll get more into that a little bit more in the next part when we talk about learning the politics. But fundamentally, your boss has got a particular agenda. That boss has chosen that this is the way they're going to execute that, and they have chosen within their morals and their approaches to allow you to lie on their behalf, or to encourage you, or even force you to lie on their behalf. But at what point do you say, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm out of here? You know, very big decision, but the more you think about it beforehand, the deeper you get into really pulling apart that issue, the more options that you will start to develop. And at the end of the day, I'm realistic enough to know you might still go with it and still try to do it, but I bet you it won't work half as well, because your heart's not in it, and they'll see it. Yes, they can see. They can see when it's not real. And that is where the limitations start to come of trying to, sort of play a blinder on somebody else and try to hoodwink other people. Because particularly at senior levels, they get experience. They know, they can smell a rat, and then they'll be all over you, and the whole team will start to suffer even more. So there is no straight answer to that, I'm afraid, Greg, but more thinking, more self-awareness, and more realistic conversations and trust with your side of the equation will certainly help you to sort of, as a team, pick through that one. Okay, Ray, have we got another one?
We do. We have a bunch. Sarah is asking, groups and project teams sometimes exist for a long time and some for a short time. So will we learn different strategies that take these time frames into consideration?
Yes, I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, what we've got is there are a variety of different approaches that you can use, but the most important thing to base this on is your understanding that it is a short-term team. Given that it is a short-term team, what is the optimum way to get in there and influence it? And particularly things like, and we'll be doing this in the third part when we talk about trust, with a short-term team, you have got no latitude whatsoever. You've got to get in there, you've got to build your credibility fast, you've got to build that trust as quickly as possible so that you can start to get to a productive decision making point in time. With others, you might have more luxury to actually have more social interactions and things like that. So it's really, there are no hard and fast rules here or approaches to take, other than there's a complete repertoire that we're going to be sharing, and it's in the application of those different things that the magic starts to happen and starts to be tailored to the specific situation that you want to influence. So yeah, there are some general themes, and we'll talk about those a little bit more as the program progresses. Any more, Rain? I'm conscious of time. We did say this was going to be an hour, so.
We do. Sudeep, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asks how to align with the powerful group.
How to align with the powerful group. We're going to be talking a lot more about power in part 4, but there's other things that you can read and just search on the website to start jumping ahead of the time within the program. But if you want to align yourself with powerful people, you've got to be recognise them as adding value to them. And that's the long and the short of it. I mean, one of the rules that I have behind a lot of the work that I do is that, if you want to influence somebody, find a way to demonstrate how you're adding to their power. If you want to, if you fail to influence, chances are they perceive you to be negating some of their power or pulling some of their power away or threatening their power. So if you want somebody to oppose you, threaten their power. If you want somebody to think, oh, you're the best thing since life, you're somebody who really well needs to be on my team, demonstrate how you can add to their power. And the power, we'll talk about different sources of power later on in the program, but from what we've already covered is if you can understand what their agenda is, that will be very, very closely linked to what is making them powerful within the organizational setting. So as soon as you start talking to their agenda, they will start to take more notice of you. Then that gives you the opportunity to start to add value or show how you can add value, and then suddenly they will bring you closer. Because at the end of the day, if you want to achieve something and you spot somebody else that can help you, you'll be nice to them. You'll want to be friendly with them. You'll want to bring them closer to see how they can actually help you. And when they start delivering the goods for you, you will really appreciate them, and therefore will be more amenable when they need something back the other way. So that's the very quick answer to it. But get close to their agenda, add value to their agenda. Okay, perhaps one more if there is one.
We do. We still have quite a few, but Ravindran is asking, if you see a lot of unethical things around you within the company you work, how do we keep optimism there in your own professional life?
That's a difficult one, and I'm not naive enough to think that the world is all operating in a very authentic and ethical way. It's not, and I know that. But I think one of the things that needs to be done is that you need to become increasingly independent of mind, even though you continue working within an environment like that. Working in an environment like that is a choice. It may not seem like that all the time, but the quicker you can get yourself to the position where you are empowered enough in your professional work that at any moment in time you could leave and go somewhere else, the sooner you will start to realize that you don't necessarily have to put up with all of that. Or you could say, yes, okay, I understand that's the way they're doing it, and all things considered, I want to stay. But now, what are the limitations? So as we were talking to an earlier question about being asked to lie, you can start to draw up where your boundaries are. What are you prepared to accept in that environment? But it still comes back to, you've got to understand what they're doing. And if they're lying, if they're cheating, if they're stabbing each other in the back, to ignore it is suicidal. It doesn't come down to ethics. It is just stupid to ignore it. You've really got to get to grips with what they're actually doing, because what you need to know is when they're about to stab you in the back. And if they're about to stab you in the back, then it becomes very painful to you. So you've got to be able to get your hands on the way they're operating and the way they're doing things, so that you can protect yourself, so that you can actually bring your limitations into play when they're needed, rather than find out later on you've been disadvantaged in a big way. But fundamentally, and it's a difficult thing to do, is, if you're in a situation and an environment where it's totally unethical and you can't live with it, then you're going to have to start making some decisions at some stage. I never said at the beginning of this program it was going to be easy. My job here is to actually really put the decisions at your feet and help you to actually think some of those things through as clearly as possible. And what I find is that 9 times out of 10, people work out how to actually behave and how to isolate themselves within and protect themselves within very hostile environments, so that they can continue to add value and be paid and have a good time without breaching any of their personal sort of levels of integrity. But it's about being consciously aware of it and working through that. So, I hope that was not such difficult news for you, Sudip, but that's the answer that I'm afraid I can only give, because there is no clear way of doing it. We've each got to find our own way of sort of moving forward. But to finish, what I'd like to do now is to just talk about my advice on what you should do next as a result of listening to this. Obviously, you can rewatch it. You can watch it as many times as you like. But fundamentally, this program is about implementing things and doing things differently. So my suggestions there on the screen are, to begin with, decide where is it you want to be successful. Now, we all want to be successful everywhere, but what is the most important thing to you right now in your working life, in your professional life, where you want to apply more influence and be more successful? It could be your organization, your division, or maybe it's just your team, but settle on something, because then you can go a little bit deeper. And particularly if you're looking at an organizational level, point number 2 there is about, well, what groups are there within that arena? So start to break it down. And there are exercises that you can do and further readings on the website with this part that will help you to do that a little bit better. Because you need to understand what are the most important groups that you need to focus on. And point number 3 I would like you to do is to actually analyze it. Analyze the arena as a whole. What pressures is it under? What is its history, etc. And all of those things that I covered earlier on, and write them down. If you're on this program with colleagues, get your heads together, because you're probably looking at the same arena. So maybe at the next team meeting or something like that, just codify what it is you do know. Share your ideas and your thoughts, so that in a way you could almost like, imagine you're presenting it to me or to one of your key stakeholders, your analysis of your arena. This is the dynamic that is going on. These are the pressures, etc. And get ready to present it. Because this helps you to land the real practical stuff and the real things that you can do. Don't just intellectualize it, get ready to present it. And then within your arena, and it becomes a bit difficult when you're just focusing on your team, but on the presumption that you're looking at the bigger picture and looking at a bigger arena, look at the most important groups to you and start to analyze them. And again, there is a check sheet that you can use as part of this that will go through all of the key things that you need to codify. It's actually the same things as the arena as a whole, but just on a different level of analysis. But what is going to be interesting, after you've done maybe 2 or 3 groups that you're connected with within your arena, you will start to notice some of the differences between them and some of the things in common. And that's where the picture starts to come into focus. And that's the whole point of doing this, so that you can build up that greater degree of surety about what's actually going on. But it does take time. It does take a lot of initiative and a lot of effort to do that. But you've got a little bit of time, so apply yourself to it. Do something, but at least do something before you engage in the next part by way of the analysis. Because what we've got to do next is sort of go in part two, is going through to looking at the politics within either your arena or a particular group. So we'll do that on the next point, and some of the questions that we've already had are really talking to that topic. So next one will be really interesting. But also then, as we progress through the program, or as you progress through the program, looking at the relationships will be the next port of call to sort of make sure that we've got more intelligence coming through, so that we can then start to see, well, so fundamentally, what are the power dynamics going on within the realm where I want to be successful that maybe I can tap into or do something with. And it's at that stage later on in the program, in part 5, that we'll start to look at, well, okay, so what are you going to shoot for and how are you going to do it? And then get really practical in terms of your action steps, your plans, your strategies that you're going to be able to help to make forward. And then, of course, just as a little reminder, at the end of the program in part 6, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can build your reputation, increase your impact as you start to implement some of these ideas and get some results. So that's all I'm going to say at this juncture. I appreciate I've gone over a little bit. Hopefully you've been able to stay with it. And it's really important to me that you do actually do something here. This is a program about implementation, so have a go. And also, if you're with other colleagues doing it, share your ideas, share your thoughts. But keep reading, keep looking at the website, and I look forward to seeing you on the next part. So thank you very much for your time.